It's Mo. It is July 7th and I have finished 2 books in July so far, and so it is time to start another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. This is a video that I do every month where I talk about the books that I've read throughout the month as soon as possible after I've read them as I can, and I try to talk for about 5 minutes. I tell you what the book's about and what I thought of the book, try to give you some insight as to whether you might want to read it or not. The first book that I finished in July was The Deep by Rivers Solomon. I read this book on audio, and this is a very short book with an interesting backstory. This book was written by Rivers Solomon based on a song and music by a group, which of course I don't remember the name of off the top of my head. And then that in turn was based off of a song that they had heard from a mostly instrumental artist. So the mostly instrumental artist made their song. The next group made a song based on that song that revolved around the idea of creatures who live in the sea who were born of the children of slaves that were thrown overboard on slave trips because pregnant women at that time were an inconvenience. Obviously, this is a little bit before they realized that having pregnant slaves was good because it increased the amount of slaves that you had. Then Rivers Solomon created a book around that, working closely with the second group. It's described in an afterwards almost as a game of telephone, and then the game of telephone goes to you, the reader, and to me, the content creator who is now telling you about it. So it's always going to be like morphing, changing, growing, which I thought was a really interesting idea. The book, The Deep, follows one main character. She is what we would call a mermaid, but it's never specifically said that. And she is the memory holder for her whole species. So the mermaids in this tale don't keep their memories. They're able to live freely and happily because they don't keep any memories, even their own memories throughout their own lives, in the forefront of their mind. But our main character is someone who holds all the memories, and she has had these memories passed down to her from other memory keepers. These creatures have very long lives, and at the end of a memory keeper's life, they pass their memories on to a new memory keeper. But unfortunately, our main character feels like she was the wrong choice to hold these memories because she struggles with having to hold them and for having to deal with all the pain that she experiences from when she was a tiny creature in the belly of a discarded slave to any other event that happens throughout the history of these mermaids. As our main character struggles with this, as she experiences memories almost against her will, she's getting ready to have a ceremony that they have every year where she shares the memory with her fellow mermaids, mermen, merpeople. She is really like worried about it because it's very stressful. She has to take care of it, and she's had these memories since she was a tiny girl, and it feels a relief to give them up even for a short time, but it's also so stressful for her to guide her people through this experience. That is kind of the general premise of the story. Things happen during this memory ceremony that lead our character to experience new things and find out new species and ideas. It was a very short book. I read it on audio. One of the band members read it, which was very cool. This was my first time reading Rivers Solomon, and I was super happy to get to a book of theirs. I have another one of their books as well that I would like to read, and it made me more interested to read it. I enjoyed my experience with it for sure. It wasn't as heartbreaking or engaging for me as I see it be for many other people, especially on BookTube, but I thought a lot of the themes in it were super interesting, and the ideas in it, and of course the idea of oral history and memory and keeping history alive and documenting things and shared memory and shared trauma. This would be a great one to read like with a group of people because there were a lot of topics that you could go into like more intense discussion of. I felt that it read a little YA, and since I've been reading quite a few YAs, I'm a little burnt out on YA, but there were so many adult topics that I'm not sure if it was the simplicity of the text that made me feel that way. I was pleasantly surprised that I liked the fantasy of the mer people, because fantasy and weird names and words that I don't understand in various fantasy languages sometimes are not my favorite thing in books. But overall, I really enjoyed it. I'm excited to read more River Solomon, and I would definitely suggest reading it. It's so short on audio. I think maybe reading it as a physical copy, I would have been a little bit more connected to it. So I think either way would be a great way to read this one. The next book that I read in July was Homebody by Rupi Kaur. I just found this one at a book sale in Freehold, New Jersey, and this is the third of Rupi Kaur's poetry books that she has written. I have read all of her work so far in order. So Milk and Honey was her first book, which I read last year, and then The Sun and Her Flowers, which I read earlier this year, and now Homebody. It's funny because I don't particularly identify with or love Rupi Kaur's poetry. I like it. It's interesting. She has a very distinctive style, I think. But it's not something that I like, oh, I can't wait to read it. Except I've read all her books and I keep reading them and I keep picking them up. I think the thing that I find so interesting about Rupi Kaur's poetry is her journey throughout the books and how you see her kind of evolving and growing up and changing throughout her work. So Rupi Kaur is a Canadian Indian person. She dealt with a lot of terrible things in her life. She was sexually abused for many years, and that kind of led her to other abusive relationships. She struggles with being an immigrant. She struggles with being a person of color, you know, all those things that American people and Canadian people and people from different places deal with. The discrimination, the racism, the misogyny from being a woman, etc., etc. So she deals with all those things, but as she's writing, she's growing up too. So you see different aspects of her self-love, you see her struggle with mental health, you see her come to certain beliefs of feminism and other things that she's growing into, and I think it's interesting. Her work is usually extremely short, just like a line or two. Her books are usually divided into different segments, so in this one we have mind, heart, etc., etc., and she often has these little pictures that she draws with them. So it's a very distinctive style, and I don't love it. I don't like her drawings the majority of the time. I find them distracting from the poetry because they're so on the nose. But I think she's worth reading. It takes you no time to read her work, and you do gain insight into her experiences and her healing journey and her mental health, and I think it's an interesting way to read about those things. Those were the first two books that I read in July, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is July 9th, and I have finished two more books in July. I finished Arc by Veronica Roth. This is a very short story that I got with one of my subscriptions. I've read two other books from this short story collection, and I've really enjoyed both of them, and I really enjoyed Arc. I've never read any Veronica Roth before, so I didn't know what to expect. Arc takes place in the not too distant future and follows a group of scientists as they sort seeds that have been collected to go on a spaceship because the world is ending. A comet is coming to destroy the world, and they're getting all these plants and stuff ready to go into space that hopefully someone can find. So they're up in the Arctic Circle where there's a seed storage facility, and this story follows one main scientist and kind of her journey in the final weeks of the Earth. I really liked this one. I thought it was like well paced and constructed so that it read very quickly but had a lot to say in it, and you got a lot of the backstory of multiple characters. You learned about this disaster of the earth, you learned about these people's lives in such a very short amount of time. I love when these short stories do that, when they really have so much about them that you learn, and it feels like a very complete and whole world and story. It doesn't feel like rushed or overly simplified or overly complicated. The next book that I read in July was A Taste for Death by P.D. James. This is the 7th in the Adam Dalgliesh series, and it follows Adam Dalgliesh, who is a British police officer, as he is forming his murder squad. So in the previous books, he was mostly working alone, but did have a sergeant with him, and now this is the official book where Scotland Yard has accepted that they need a murder squad and has assigned Adam Dalgleish and his team. But this might not be the first book where we meet Kate Mishkin, but this is a book that talks a lot about her and her life. We really get the feel for Dalgleish, Missingham, and Kate Mishkin's relationship, early relationship, the forming of this squad as they're looking for a murderer who brutally slit the throats of two people in a church vestry. One of the men who was killed is a man in politics who has recently resigned, who seemingly had a religious experience not too long ago in the church, and the other man is a homeless man who sometimes sleeps in the church. So the first mystery that they kind of have to discover is like why these people were together, why this church, what was the spiritual revelation that this man had, and then of course it all leads back to the family and they have to investigate everyone involved with this politician. I mean, this book is super long. I was surprised at how long it was. I've read quite a few of the Adam Dalgleish series. I think most of them. I think I only have 2 or 3 left to read, but I've been reading them all out of order. One day I'll probably go back and read them in order. But most of the books are like less than half of the size of this book. This book was over 500 pages, probably a little less if you read it in a non-mass market paperback form. And I just don't see why it needed to be so long. Like, her books are awesome. I love her writing. She's one of my all-time favorite mystery writers. And I love the way that P.D. James has like a very descriptive, evocative writing style, but without it being purple prose. Her writing is very pretty, but it's not like over the top. And I love that about her writing. So it's not hard to read a 500-page book by her because her writing style just moves you along. You're just invested. You want to know. Each sentence leads so seamlessly to the next sentence. Each part leads so seamlessly. The majority of the time. This book just didn't need as much padding as it had. This book was written in the 80s, and I wonder if this was a time where she was getting paid more, like per page, you know, a higher page count meant a higher salary, because the majority of the Dalgleish novels are just not this long. I did think there were a couple instances in this book where her writing was not so seamless, where there were things that I was like, oh, did I miss a section? Did they say that explicitly? And then I went back and they had not said it explicitly. I wonder if that was the author's choice, or I wonder if that was a editing choice. This book definitely could have used better editing, I think, overall, definitely for length. So some of those things kind of surprised me. I mean, in some instances, maybe she wanted you to think one thing, so she didn't explicitly tell you what happened, and then another thing happened. There was a event that happens that I think was like that, but there were other things that happened that I was like, did I miss a passage? Like, I didn't hear them say that or see that happen in the book. So it was a little bit confusing. I did like the introduction of the murder squad, and I like that in this book, as his murder squad is getting set up, Dalgleish is really struggling with being a police officer, which is something that we see a lot in the later books. He's really struggling with what his job means both to him and the world. He's really struggling with the good he does versus the pain that he has to inflict on people, like emotional and mental pain that he ends up having to inflict, and is what he does morally right in many respects. That's a topic that comes up a lot in the later Dalgleish books, but we're just starting to see it in this book. And of course, since I have been reading them out of order, I'm not sure if there were hintings of this in book 6, because I don't remember book 6, because I don't remember when I read book 6, and I don't even know which book it was. In some ways, reading them out of order makes me take them at face value, but because I know so much else about what's gone on, both before and after the book that I'm reading, I also am like solving the puzzle of like how everything fits together, which is why I think it would be good to go back and read these books in order at some point. But I think when I finish the Adam Dalgleish series, I'm going to read the 3 or 4 books in the Cordelia Gray series. Those I'll read in order, and then I'll decide if and when I want to go back and read the Dalgleish series. in order. Let me know if you've read any P.D. James. I would love to know, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is July 13th, and I have finished one more book in July. I finished The Girl from the Well by Ren Shifeko. This is a young adult horror novel that I picked up at a little free library, I think, or possibly a book sale, because I was interested to read some Ren Shifeko. I know they have a polyamorous vampire romantasy out there right now that everybody's reading, and it sounds really good. So I found this one. I thought I would read it first. This is a young adult horror, and it is definitely very horrific. I read this book on audio, and I really enjoyed the audio narration, but this book starts off with a bang. Our very first scene, we're encountering our main character, who is a ghost of a young girl who was tortured and murdered, and she now roams the world seeking revenge on people who abuse children. So the very first scene, she finds a man who has recently murdered a girl, and it's very gory, it's very gruesome, and our ghost main character murders this man in the manner that she usually does. From there, she goes on to look for other child abusers, and she stumbles on a serial killer's next victim who she becomes enamored with and finds that she has a connection with. We're following our ghost main character, and we're following this teenage boy, learning about him. He has a very dark and secretive past. As we're following both of them and they are coming to know each other, we learn the pasts of both of these characters, and we see many more murders and many more horrific things, and other characters are involved as well. I don't want to say too much about this because I think it is a good one to kind of go into without knowing too much, because there's a lot of Japanese references, there's a lot of folklore, there's a lot of mysticism, there's a lot of supernatural elements that are in part based on myth and folk tales, and probably some that are based on real life as well. So it was interesting because it definitely felt like a very Japanese history to me, and even the way that it was told felt like a translated work. I mean, I don't know if that was in part because it's a young adult novel, but sometimes it felt a little clunky, like it had been translated. But maybe that was the aim of Shifeko, to try to make it feel foreign to an American reader, make it feel like you were not on steady ground, you were in a culture that you didn't necessarily understand. But no matter what the reasoning behind it was, I really did enjoy it. It was definitely very gruesome, very gory. There's murder, there's blood, there's body horror, there's sexual assault, there's rape, there's torture, there's drowning, there's body mutilation, so many disgusting things. Definitely did not pull its punches. There wasn't a lot of actual murder, even if it was the revenge murder on the page, but there was enough of it that it was definitely very gory and very creepy and disturbing in parts. So if you are sensitive to any of those things, I mean, it is a horror book, but if you are sensitive to any of those things, I would definitely suggest looking it up. I don't know who this book is geared towards or marketed towards, because it felt way too adult in its gore and gruesome aspects, but it felt way too young adult for me for an adult narration or adult perspective. On the whole, I really enjoyed it. I read this book for Summerween, and I'm super excited to read more Ren Shifeko. If you've read any of their work, let me know in the comments below. It is July 16th, and I finished 2 more books in July. I'm obviously in a different location. I'm cat sitting, and I don't have the 2 books that I finished, but I want to talk about them while they're still fresh in my mind. The first book that I finished was Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. I read this for Summerween. I read this for my summer TBR. I read this because this was the Riley Sager book that I was most interested in. I've only ever read Final Girls by Riley Sager, which was like, okay. It was kind of a slow, kind of a boring thriller, but I liked some of the aspects of it, but I didn't love it. It was fine. Like, I didn't hate it like a lot of people do, but I definitely didn't love it. I was really excited for Home Before Dark because a lot of people really like that book by Riley Sager. Home Before Dark is about Maggie, who, when she was 5 years old, her and her family moved into kind of a secluded mansion in Vermont, and this mansion had like a dark past. They moved into it anyway, and as they were trying to get settled in, weird things started happening. Maggie's dad started to get really curious about what the past of the house was, and things started progressing, and after 20 days they had to flee the house. Maggie's dad ended up writing a book about this, about their experience, about what happened, and this book kind of took over their lives. Although Maggie can't remember the events that happened over those 20 days in July when she was 5, her life has been like dictated by this book, and she has always felt kind of confined by it, kind of defined by it, and she's really resented it. She knows that what was written in the book couldn't possibly be true, but her father and mother, even after their divorce, even after they've been separated for a long time, refuse to tell her anything different. They both just don't want to talk about it, they don't want to discuss it, and her father just tells her that it's true, and that's just what it is. On her father's deathbed, Maggie finds out that not only is there probably a lot more to this story than she even ever thought, but that her father actually still owns the house, and she's now inherited it. So, of course, Maggie goes to the house to find out more. That's the premise of the book. It sets you up for like family interactions and family discoveries happening. Of course, there's two families that have worked in the house since her parents were there. There is the grandfather of like the handyman and the groundskeeper, and there is the daughter of the woman who was the last housekeeper there. Her mother was from a long line of housekeepers who worked in the house. So Maggie starts unraveling all these different histories and meeting all these different people. The last people to live in the house, one of the families still lives in the area. Maggie wants to talk to everyone involved in knowing anything at all about the house. So you have all this cast of characters. You have your old housekeeper, you have your young hot handyman, you have a variety of town folks, you know, telling you different things, and you're finding out little bits and pieces from them. So it sets you up for this great haunted house story. It sets you up with everything that you need, but it's so slow and repetitive. The other aspect of this book is that it's a book within a book. So while you're reading Maggie going through this, you're also reading the book that her father wrote. You're getting a lot of repetition from that because you will read something, or Maggie will discover something, or Maggie will remember something. She'll tell you about it, but then you'll read that chapter in the book. Or vice versa, maybe you'll read a chapter in the book that then something similar happens to Maggie in the present, so you are getting that again. So it was really, really repetitive, and it was really like, what's the word? Like, it talked down to the reader a little bit, I felt like. The book didn't let you like extrapolate any information. It didn't let you like say like, oh my God, maybe this was this. It was just like, this was this. It would set it up, and then it would be like, no, this was this. Wait, did I tell you this was this? Those aspects took me out of the story because I was like, yeah, I could figure that out on my own. Obviously, that's why I'm here, to like think about this story. All of this, I think, was quite similar to Final Girls in that like the story was really slow and not a lot of things happened. Like the endings of both the stories got faster, but I definitely didn't need over 300 pages, almost 400 pages in Home Before Dark to go over the things that we went over. And although I really like a book within a book story, something that I struggled with was that we got one chapter of the book within the book and one chapter of Maggie's story. One. And it just was really annoying to change perspectives that much. It was just a dual perspective novel, really, at that point. Yes, there was a book within a book, but it would have been cooler to get like maybe a chapter of the book and then 2 or 3 chapters from Maggie and skip over some of the book that you just learned about from Maggie. I definitely didn't love it. And I'm disappointed because I thought that this was going to be the Riley Sager that I would really, really like, and it just wasn't it. So to make up for that overly long book, I read The Stepford Wives by Ira Levin. This is a obviously very famous cult classic, very short horror that came out in 1972 about a woman and her family who move from the city to a seemingly perfect suburb. So her husband still works in the city. Now that their kids are getting older, they want to move somewhere a little bit more family friendly. They want the kids to touch grass. Our main character Joanna wants to make her photography studio in her basement because she is really passionate about photography, and she's been selling her photographs, and that's something that she likes to do on the side. She and her husband are both like well educated, they're decently well off. So they buy this big house in the suburbs, and immediately upon getting there, Joanna starts to think that maybe something is weird about this housing development and this little area. Stepford is full of people with families, full of people just like them, where the husbands are working, they're going into the city, or they're working in nearby factories and offices at kind of high profile, important jobs, and the housewives are staying home. The more Joanna learns about these housewives, the more she meets them, the more she feels that they're really obsessed with housework and that they just live to take care of their husband and children. They have no other interests, and she starts to become really suspicious of this. When she meets another newcomer to the area, Bobby, who's much more like Joanna than any of the other women in the area, she and Bobby start to really be concerned with what is going on in Stepford. I think a lot of people know this story because it was made into several movies, and it is just like now a horror classic. And I knew the general premise. I knew that the Stepford wives were all the same. I knew that it was like a very culty kind of thing where all the women were beautiful, all the women were obsessed with housework, all the women were perfect, all the women were obsessed with their men. So I knew those aspects, and it's become like almost a cliche, right? But it's so much more like psychological than that, and it's so much more disturbing and creepy. Like, I didn't think it was going to be as creepy as it was. So I really, really enjoyed this one. It's 124 pages. It's super short. I read it all in one day. I would suggest reading it that way, actually, because the tension in it does really ramp up. I just really enjoyed it. I've never read any Ira Levin. He also wrote Rosemary's Baby, which my friend Suzanne recently said was a book that really scared her. So I do want to read Rosemary's Baby at some point, and just more by Ira Levin in general. The Stepford Wives was surprisingly poignant or timely for our time, and that idea of like homogenization, that idea of lack of autonomy, that idea of everyone trying to be exactly the same, everyone looking exactly the same. I think it's worth a read today, definitely. And those are 2 more books that I read in July, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. Gary, what day is it? It is July 20th, and I have read 3 more books in July. I finished The Bullet That Missed by Richard Oseman. I took this on the plane with me to Ohio, and I read it in like 3 days. It was super fun. It is the next installment in the Thursday Murder Club. So if you haven't heard of the Thursday Murder Club before, this is a cozy mystery series following a group of retirees. They all have retired from interesting jobs. There's a nurse, there's a psychologist, there's a former activist, there's a former MI5 or MI6 worker, and in their spare time at their retirement village, they like to solve cold cases with one of the main characters, Elizabeth's best friend, Penny. Unfortunately, Penny has advanced in her illnesses and is currently in hospice in the first book. So they bring in Joyce, a new person at the retirement village. They are just getting into the Thursday Murder Club, solving cold cases when a real live murder shows up on their doorstep. So that's the beginning of the first book, and then the second and third books follow those premise. In the third book, we're seeing people who we have seen before. We are seeing people who were in the first and second books, either in small roles or larger roles, and we're seeing connections being made between everyone involved in the story. It is a super fun, easy to read, fly through cozy mystery series. I really, really enjoy it. Really love all the British references. I do think it is very, very, very English, so you have to know some English humor. The next book that I finished in July is My Sister the Serial Killer by Okan and Braithwaite. This is a short, I would say thriller novel about two sisters from Nigeria living in Nigeria. One of them is a nurse, and her younger sister is like kind of the favorite of most people. Her younger sister is beautiful and men love her, and she always has boyfriends. She has people doting on her. Their mother loves her, and our main character, the older sister, loves her too, but knows a lot of her flaws. And when she's called to the house of her younger sister's current boyfriend because her younger sister has just killed him supposedly in self-defense, our main character thinks, oh no, not again. So this follows really the sister relationship, but it does have some like thrilling moments where the older sister is really trying to control things and things are unraveling and out of control. Our main character is very much a control freak because of her sister's actions and also just because of their lives in general, where she is a neat freak. It helps her in her job as a nurse, but it also helps her when she's trying to help her sister. I really like this one. It reminded me a lot of the other Okan and Braithwaite that I read, which was a very short story. That one was called Treasure, just in that some of the like social media aspects and some of the aspects of doing things that are obviously wrong, but you don't know the difference. You're not able to tell reality or actual reality from what you perceive as reality. There were a lot of kind of themes like that. I read this one in audio, and I do have a physical copy, but not with me. I did really enjoy it. I think I would like to read it again physically because I do think the audio was a little quick. Maybe it was like too easy to read it on audio, although the audio narrator, which I can't remember her name, I will list it down below, is fantastic, so I definitely highly recommend listening to her. The next book that I finished in July is A Night Without Armor, Poems by Joao, and this is by the musical artist Joao. This was written in 1996, and I couldn't remember if I'd read this one or not before, so I did pick this up while I was in Ohio and decided to read it again. Now, the reason that I picked it up and the reason that I decided to read it again was because I've been seeing it all over the place a lot recently, so I was like, you know what, it's a sign, let me just grab it. I passed up the opportunity to get it many times at little free libraries and different book sales and stuff, and I couldn't remember if I had read it, and I have read it before in the 90s. I liked Joao in the 90s. I don't think I had any of her albums, but like I liked her hits, and I liked her like story. She has like an interesting like story. She has a very interesting history, true story about her life, but I think that in the 90s it was like spun in a very specific way that was quite appealing for someone who was a teenager in the 90s. And her poems were okay. They reminded me a lot of the Rupi Kaur poems that I've been reading recently. I would say they're like spiritual sisters, maybe. Definitely Joao obviously came out long before the Rupi Kaur, probably long before Rupi Kaur was even born. I think some of the topics are similar. I think Rupi Kaur is a little bit more honest and forthcoming with like the trauma that she has dealt with, whereas Joao has also dealt with a lot of trauma, but I don't think she's as obvious about it in her poetry, at least not in this collection. I'm not sure if she has another collection as well. I thought it was okay. I'm glad that I reread it. I'm glad that I know that I reread it. I don't think I'll ever have to reread it again, and I will definitely be unhauling it at the end of the year. And those were 3 more books that I read in July. It is July 26th, and I have finished 1 more book in July. I have finished The Guest Cat by Takashi Horade. This is a super short little novella about a couple who work in the city, live in the city, and they have not too long ago moved into a little guest house of a larger estate. So there's kind of a large gated estate with a big garden, and the owners, an older couple, have divided the space so that there's 2 little guest houses on the property that they are now renting out. Our couple moves in, and shortly after they move in, they make friends with the older couple, but they never really see the other people in the other guest house, in the other rental, until they learn that that couple has a young child, and that young young child has found a stray cat and they're going to keep the cat. It's just something that, along with the changing seasons of the garden and along with the peculiarities of the little alleyway that they live on, our main character couple have noticed. So it's told from the perspective of the man in the relationship, and he is talking about how he was never a pet person, never a cat person, but his wife was, and he never really understood being a pet person. And then one day the new little kitten starts visiting them a little at a time each day, never living with them fully, never being totally at ease with them, never letting them pick her up or anything like that, but they come to have this little kitten as part of their lives, and they come to like look forward to this little kitten being in their lives. Around that time, the husband of the older couple falls ill and the older couple move out. So now our main characters are also taking care of the main estate. So they're using it almost as if their own. So while they're kind of falling in love with this kitten, they're also learning to love the garden and see the garden through her eyes. They're learning about the main house. It's just a very simple, I would say probably autofiction story about two writers and their experience with this kitten, their experience with the house. Not much more than that. I mean, things definitely happen in this book, but it's a very quiet, very simple, very mundane story for the most part. There is definitely some sad parts for people, sad parts for cats, and it does deal a lot with grief and the idea of loving something even if it's not yours, and the idea of taking care of things that aren't yours, and the idea of maybe finding out that something that you love isn't only for you, that other people enjoy that thing or person or animal as well. So I really enjoyed it. It didn't read as quickly as I thought it was going to, but I would definitely read more by this author. He is also a poet, so I would love to read some of his poetry if I can. Even though this wasn't an entirely happy cat story, it wasn't like a super sad, horrible cat story, and it did, I think, have a satisfying ending. It is July 29th, and I have finished 3 more books in July. I finished Artificial Condition by Martha Wells. This is the second in the Murderbot series. I read the first one last year or 2 years ago, and then I gave it to my dad. He read all of the series, but he read them out of order, which is not a good idea, so I am reading them in order. I liked the first Murderbot book. I didn't love it the way some people do, and so I didn't want to buy the other books or acquire the other books. I don't think I need to own them physically. I already unhauled All Systems Read, the first book, so I found them on one of my free audio sites, so I read Artificial Condition on audio. I liked this book. It was much slower to start than All Systems Read. It was worrying me at first. If it didn't pick up, I might have ended up like DNFing the series, and I feel like that's going to be kind of a common theme for the series in general. I think if there comes a time within one of the books that I'm disinterested, I might just stop because I'm not like loving it so much. That being said, it did pick up in the second half of the second book, and I liked it, I would say, just as well, if not a little bit more than All Systems Read. Like, I liked All Systems Read a little bit more because we were just learning about Murderbot, learning their story, finding out about what is going to be the kind of trajectory for this series. But I think I liked Artificial Condition a little bit better because they're also becoming a more fleshed out character. These novellas are super short, like 150 pages or under, so you don't get a lot of time to learn about each character. So I think the progression of learning more about our main character is what I enjoyed most about Artificial Condition. If you don't know what the Murderbot series is about, it follows a murderbot who is a security bot who has hacked its own system. It is an AI, and its main purpose for being is to protect the people that it's with. Usually it has a governing chip that keeps its AI personality at bay, but Murderbot, who is self-named, has hacked its own chip and now is free to do whatever it wants. And what it wants to do is mainly watch TV and laze around, kind of not deal with the issues that it has had in the past. But it also does want to help its human counterparts and its assigned jobs. It doesn't really want to do a lot of work, but it wants to do some work. They want to do some work. In All Systems Red, they are on a mission with a group of humans, and their main concern is keeping the humans from realizing that it is now a totally sentient being. When the mission starts to go awry, Murderbot has to jump into action and help the humans kind of beyond even its program nature would intend. The second book follows Murderbot directly after the events of the first book, and they are pursuing some of the questions that were raised in the first book about their own past. So I did enjoy it. I will continue on with the next book. I might even do that soon. These are so quick, easy to get through, and since I'm working on a 5 books in 5 days challenge, it's possible that I will read another one of those. The next book that I finished for that challenge, and the next book that I finished in July, was Lost and Found in Harlem by Delia C. Pitts. This is an independently self-published contemporary noir book about Shelba Rook, who is a kind of disgraced or down on his luck veteran. He has sustained an injury and he is living in a flop house hotel in Harlem when we first meet him, and he has very little possessions and very little drive for living. He's kind of just sustaining himself but not really living. He doesn't really have a job, he doesn't have any connections in life, and when the hotel that he's been staying in burns down, he has even less connections to the life he's living. He is a little bit suspicious about this fire, and when he investigates a little bit further, he finds the card of a private investigator in one of the rooms where someone died, and he decides that this might have bearing on this fire case. So Shelba goes to the Ross Private Detective Agency, and that is when we meet our other main characters in the story, the main detective Norbert Ross and his daughter Brina. Shelba lucks into meeting these people and also in securing a position with the Ross agency, and then the book goes on from there. So we're meeting the characters of Harlem and the different people involved in the Ross agency and surrounding the Ross agency. We're also investigating several crimes that have happened recently that may or may not be connected to the fire in the hotel. I loved this book. I definitely have a stigma of self-published books, and I definitely didn't have high hopes for this book, but I really ended up loving it. I thought it was extremely well written, extremely well done. It's very short at only 118 pages. Sometimes you wondered if all these pieces that were moving in this book, a surprising amount for such a short book, were going to come together, but in the end it definitely did come together and definitely made me want to continue on. There was also some really good moments where hints and tidbits were dropped from Shelba's past that really make you want to know what happened to him, how he got into the position he was in. He's from Texas. How did he get to Harlem? Why is Harlem the way it is? And what's happening there? So I was so pleasantly surprised, and I really, really love this book, and I think I'm going to break my own rules and go ahead and buy new physical copies of these books because they are available on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited, but since I don't have that, I think that I could buy the self-published books. Although I don't buy new books, it would be a great way to support the book community. If you like noir books, if you like books about New York, if you like contemporary mysteries with a classic mystery feel, I highly recommend Lost and Found in Harlem. The next book that I've read so far in July is Darkness Visible, a Memoir of Madness by William Styron. This is a kind of long essay at 84 pages about Styron's experience having severe clinical depression later in his life when he was in his 60s. As he explains through this book, he's probably had depression his whole life, but due to a confluence of events, it becomes extremely severe and results in him being hospitalized. So this is a really interesting book. He wrote it in response to an article that he read kind of poo-pooing depression and the idea that people should talk about depression openly. So William Styron wrote this article and then turned it into a longer essay and then turned it into a longer book about how we definitely need to be talking about depression, how depression is an absolutely horrible and debilitating disease that so many people suffer from, especially in the United States, but that it does have a very high success rate. But one of the ways to ensure that it is survived is by talking about it, is by seeking help, is by having a really great support system. And so he wanted to write this article. It was really interesting. It has a lot to do with suicide. It has a lot to do with the symptoms of depression that maybe people don't really realize. It has a lot to do with different forms of depression and what might bring that on and what might exacerbate your depression. So it was really, really fascinating. I do think that he has a very flowery, over-the-top purple prose way of writing. Like, there was barely any sentences that were just a straightforward sentence. It was like a sentence with a dash and an insert and a parentheses and then a comma and then the end of the sentence. So like, you had to kind of pay attention and read each sentence maybe more than once to understand the purpose of it. He also does name drop a lot of artists, writers, and other famous people who've suffered from depression. Some of them I knew and some of them I didn't, but I did find that to be a little bit hard to follow, especially along with his very poetic / overcomplicated way of writing. I definitely think if you're interested in people's experience of their time in a disabled state or in a state of depression or in a state of mental instability, this is a really interesting one. He obviously put a lot of thought and effort and interest into this. I feel like there's quite a few memoirs that have to do with that, and some of them are much longer, but this one is like a fairly concise and interesting thing. It definitely taught me things about depression that I wasn't aware of, or made more clear things that I was vaguely aware of. It made me think about depression, clinical depression, and manic depression and other forms of depression in kind of an interesting way. I definitely highly recommend. It's so short. I read it all in less than 24 hours, one day essentially. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, it's a good place, especially I would say to start, just because it is so short. It might not be the best place to start as far as its language and the way that it's told. So those were 3 more books that I read in July, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is August and I finished 2 more books. I finished The Lives of Joao Vencia by Jose Luandino Vieira. This is a very short, I would say autofiction, told all in a interview with a man in prison. So Joao Vencia is in prison for strangling his lover, and it is his conversation with a reporter, but it's all told from Joao's perspective. So there are aspects where he refers to something that the reporter said or reacts to something that the reporter said, but you are not seeing any of those interactions. Like, you don't hear the reporter's voice, you only hear our main character. And it talks about loves that Joao has had through his life and about how he came to be the person he is and how he came to be in the situation that he is. It was really interesting. Feels like autofiction because Vieira was born in Portugal, raised in Angola, and then he did spend time in prison for his participation in the Angolan independence movement, which it says in his little biography in the back of the book. But it feels very like genuine about some of the aspects that he speaks about, and he kind of talks about 3 loves in his life as 3 points of a star and then a center to that star. It's told in a very stream of consciousness, very fluid, very what people refer to as like fever dream type prose. So if you are not used to that or you don't like that, it might be difficult to read. But it is only 64 pages. I read it over 2 days, but I think it would actually be better to read like all in one sitting or all over one day, just because one thought does flow so connectedly into the next thought thought and then refer back to something earlier that the author mentions or that happened. If you're not reading it all at once, you might lose the thread of it a little. I did really enjoy it. Definitely worth it. A very short read. Definitely could be read in just a few hours if you just take the time to sit down and read it. This is a translated work. It was translated by Richard Zenith. I've never read a book from Angola, so like culturally it's just interesting to see another country. This was written in 1979. It's definitely on the older side, not on the newer side. The last book that I read in July was Rogue Protocol by Martha Wells. So this is the third in the Murderbot series, and I read All Systems Red quite a while ago. Then just a few books ago, I read Artificial Condition, which I enjoyed, and now I've read Rogue Protocol. The third book in the series picks up directly after the events of Artificial Condition. In All Systems Red, the first book, we meet Murderbot, which is their self-given name. Generally, these security bots, these sec bots, are from big companies that are basically overseeing everything that humans do in this future time. So this huge corporation that once controlled Murderbot is not only looking to protect the humans in their charge, but also to mine any information that they have, to use anything they say or do for profit. Murderbot hacks their own modular chip so that they are free from their large corporation. They don't want to cause any trouble. They just want to watch TV. They just want to watch their soap operas, but they still have a strong drive to protect and take care of humans. And of course, in the first book, things go terribly wrong. Murderbot has to help its humans out. In the second book, we see that Murderbot is trying to connect with their past. They're trying to understand some of the things that happened to them that led them to become free sentient. Then in the third book, they're continuing that quest to figure out what's going on and to right wrongs that have happened in their past. And it's very episodic. I think the first 5 or 6 books are novella, and then there's one longer novel. Each novella starts right where the last one ended, and each one has us seeing characters that are inevitably going to be coming back later in the books and in the series, or that are there just to kind of teach Murderbot something about themselves, something about their quest. Now that I've read the third book, I'm much more engaged with our characters. I'm much more invested in the overall plot lines that are happening throughout. I'm much more intrigued to see which characters come back and which ones we meet again. So I'm definitely liking the series more at the third book than I did at the first book. So if you like and are interested in any sci-fi, fun, fluffy, episodic, but action-packed and endearing, there was definitely moments where I cried throughout this series, I would definitely highly recommend these books. And I would say if you read the first one and you are not in love with it, keep going. They're so short. The audiobooks are like 3 hours long. Just read them. They're fun. So that was the last book that I read in July. Overall, I had a great reading month. I read 16 books in July. I read 16 different things and so many different varieties of things. I read 2 books of poetry, which is awesome. I read a bunch of translated work. I read a couple of highly anticipated books. I read some mysteries, continuations in series that I've been working on. I read a new independent noir mystery series that I loved. I read some nonfiction. I read a YA that I really enjoyed, a YA horror, and then I think probably the best book that I read this month. It was subjectively my favorite book, but I think objectively it was the best written book as well, was The Stepford Wives. So I don't have all the books here that I read because some of them still are in Ohio, but I read so many great books. I had such a great reading month, very varied. I participated in some readathons and some reading challenges, so you will have to look out for my Readathon Recap for July, which will be coming soon. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. Let me know what you thought of them. Let me know if you participated in Summerween or any other challenges this month. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!